employed to justify my presence here, my UBI system. We learned quite a lot of new things about the brain-body system and its relationship to social cognition, broadly speaking. So this could be the first aspect of my talk of some potential interest to you. So the way we conceive how people work in a social environment is pretty different nowadays than it was when I started working in this business 30 years ago. First of all, we put a lot more emphasis on the fact that it's not possible to draw a sharp line between a purely rational cognition and the world of passions, of emotions. People understood pretty clearly now that the most irrational behavior stems from the impossibility to put your emotion at the service of your own decision. But there are even more basic aspects that dramatically changed during the last 30 years, namely our notion of what the perception of the world. Can I talk without this?
Yeah.
I think there's no point in using the mic. Such a whole. The other aspect I was saying deals with what is perception. So normally you would think that you see with your visual system, you feel touch with your tactile system, and you move with your motor system. Actually, things got pretty reshuffled, so to speak. And as I will show you in a minute, we see the world with our motor system, with our tactile system, with our affective system. So perception looks a lot more synesthetic, if you like, than it used to be a few years ago. Here in my talk, I will not have time to deal with the implications of what I'm telling you. I hope the implications somehow will emerge in discussion time. I would like just to...
Top right corner. The bottom of the right corner.
Okay. No, I was looking for the laser.
It doesn't work on the screen.
It doesn't work on the screen, okay. So maybe, if you pay attention to these three gentlemen, they look practically the same. But if you focus on their hand posture, you realize that each of those gentlemen has his own idiosyncratic way of keeping the very same posture. This is important because mirroring is a metaphor. We are not dealing with physical mirror. There are no physical mirror in the brain. Each of us is different, which in turn means that mirrors the actions of others in a very peculiar way. And we know very little about this individuality aspect of how these brain networks work. Okay. So this is basically the compass of my research during the last 20 years. How do we give sense to the nature evidence of the work of others? There are some theoretical implications in this question. Namely, the most important one is that the evidence of the behavior of the others is natural to us, which means that we are fairly well equipped on average to detect it and understand it. And we asked this question to this guy. And when I'll be speaking about the brain, I will perhaps omit to say, and I say first and for all, it doesn't make any sense to me to speak of the brain as such. So the brain is a lot more than a box of some algorithmic marvel, as many of our colleagues take it to be. So the brain makes sense and can be understood to the extent that we do not divorce the brain from the body. Okay? So it's a brain-body system, and this particular approach is a bottom-up approach to social cognition. It's not the unique approach. Actually, the mainstream approach so far has been a top-down approach. So social cognition means understanding others. What does it mean to understand others? It means to form your mind representation of their own mental representation. Here we are dealing with a wine cellar. We are dealing with something more basic, most likely from a phylogenetic point of view, older. And let me jump quickly to mirror neurons. These are motor neurons that we discovered in the premotor region of the macaque monkey brain. What is peculiar of this neuron is that besides being active when the monkey performs a motor task, namely takes possession of some object, it also responds when the monkey's motor system is apparently silent, but it's not. The muscles are silent, but the motor system is working, is simulating, this is my interpretation, what the other is doing, because also the other's action leads to the activation of the very same neuron who is in charge of guiding your own motor behavior to accomplish some very basic motor goal. This most recent paper is, I think, rather important because it shows that what this neuron deal with, particularly, is not movement per se, like opening or closing the finger, but using those movements to accomplish a specific motor goal. Here you see on the top left panel the discharge of the neuron when the monkey grasps with the bare hand. On the top right, you see the same neuron discharging when the monkey grasps. Using this particular tool is an escargot tool that French people use to eat escargot at the restaurant, which has a very peculiar biomechanic property. In order to open it, you must squeeze your hand, and in order to close it, you must open your hand. So here you accomplish the goal of taking possession of something with the opposite movement with respect to when you do it with your bare hand. Nevertheless, the neuron keeps firing, and similarly, in the bottom panels, you see the discharge of the very same neuron when the action is observed, when performed with the bare hand, or when performed with the reverse pliers. So this neuron codes the goal of an action, both when it is performed or observed, performed by someone else, regardless of the movement that are employed to accomplish that motor goal. And here is another interesting property of these neurons, namely, on average, the discharge of the neurons, of mirror neurons, is higher when the action is executed with respect to when it is observed, which means that the mechanism is somehow related to the notion of agency. So when I am the agent, the system is more active with respect to when I am the passive witness of the behavior of someone else. So they discharge during the accomplishment of the motor goal, regardless of the movements employed. They discharge significantly more during action execution than during its observation. This is another interesting paper. Mirror neurons finally made it through the channel, and they landed in London. This work comes from the lab of Roger Lemon at UCL. And they were able to show that some of these mirror neurons have a direct influence on the motor neurons sitting in the spinal cord. All of these mirror neurons are corticospinal neurons, namely are the cortical neurons that affect the excitability of the motor neuron, who are distributed in the different layers of the spinal cord, which in turn excite your muscles, making your movements possible. And a substantial percentage of these neurons, of these corticospinal mirror neurons, show a double profile of response. They are excited when the movement is executed, like in panel L, but they are inhibited, like shown in panel Q, when the action is observed. Being inhibited means they This facilitates the spinal motor neuron that make movement possible. So this is possibly one of the mechanisms that explain why, in spite of the fact that part of your motor system is active, when you are looking at someone who moves, you don't move, but you are still, your muscles are not excited. Here is another interesting experiment that where the question here was, does the distance between observer and agent affect the discharge of mirror neurons? So here my colleagues investigated the discharge of mirror neurons when the action was performed inside the peripersonal space, number 2, or outside the peripersonal space of the observing monkey. I would need to tell you what is peripersonal and extrapersonal space, but I have no time. Very quickly, a space is mapped in a multiplicity of ways in our brain. One way of mapping space deals with a very sharp dichotomy between the space I can reach, stretching out my forearm, and the space that lies beyond my reach. This is very important for moral control. So here they are exploring to which extent an action occurring within the observer peripersonal space or outside of it can modulate the discharge of mirror neurons. And they found basically 50% of the neuron that didn't bother about this distinction. Cell 3 fires both when the action occurs far away from the monkey, top, near to the monkey, middle, and at bottom you see the motor response of the same neuron. The remaining 50% of neurons were modulated by the distance, equally distributed. Half of them were more active when the observed action occurred far away from the monkey, cell 1, upper panel, and you see the middle panel of cell 1, there's no discharge at all. While the remaining 28 roughly percent show the opposite modulation. So the cell fire when the monkey was observing the agent operating within her peripersonal space and kept being silent when it occurred far away. But what is most interesting is the following. These neurons apparently are not just sensitive to the distance between the agent, but they are sensitive to something more interesting from the point of view of social cognition. If you look at the cell displayed on the top row, neuron 1, you see the neuron fires on the top left panel when the agent is grasping far away from the monkey. In the middle panel, you see the cell doesn't fire, doesn't respond, because the agent is grasping within the monkey peripersonal space. But if you look at the third panel to the right, when a transparent but rigid barrier is interposed between the observing monkey and the active human being, you see that the cell resumes its firing pattern that displayed when the action was happening far away. The interposition of the rigid panel means that this action, which physically occurs near the monkey, is like it occurred far away, because what is impeded here, like in the top left panel, is the possibility to interact. So if the monkey wanted to snatch the food from the experimenter, couldn't do it here, like it couldn't there. There because of the distance, here because of the barrier. So this shows that these neurons are sensible to potentiality of cooperation and competition, which I assume Professor Kelso will be dealing with in his talk. And they are sensitive with the motor intentions of an action. Here, monkeys were grasping or observing grasping in order to accomplish two different goals. Grasping to bring to the mouth, to eat, or grasping in order to throw away. According to the second action, there were neurons that were firing to the first grasp only if it would have led to the second goal of bringing to the mouth, but not if leading to the goal of throwing away, and vice versa. So here is the motor response. Grasp to eat. Below, grasp to place, there is no firing. Similarly, when the monkey observed the human experimenter grasping to eating, you have a visual response. Grasping to place, you have no response. And with Marco Iacoboni at UCLA, it's afterwards. And finally, an interesting neuron recorded by our colleagues at Duke University in an oculomotor parietal area, an area which is in charge of controlling our saccadic movements. So the very same cell that fires when the monkey gazes to the right will also fire when the monkey is looking at another monkey gazing in the same direction. And we believe that these neurons have something to say about the mechanism of shared attention, which is a basic ingredient for a proficient cognitive development of children. So when you teach children to speak, you quite often point to an object, say, oh, you look at that, that is a bottle. And if the child, instead of looking at the bottle, is looking in the other direction, he is training maybe more problematic. So this is very useful to have two people focusing on the same potentially interesting object, and this capacity is also apparently, at least in part, determined by a neural mechanism. So quickly to humans, these are the region of our brain that turn out to be active both when we do something or when we observe the same action performed by someone else. So we have the dorsal and ventral premotor cortex, which include the posterior part of Broca's region, which is clearly not only language specific, and the superior and inferior parietal lobe. However, it turns out that this mechanism is not confined to the domain of action, and so we have neural mechanism for directed action, communicative action, body movements, but and these are mirror neurons recorded in the human brain. So now we have evidence that these neurons exist also in our brain. Now the debate, and also here we have mirror neurons that are inhibited when we observe someone else doing something, while they are excited when we ourselves perform the action. This is particularly interesting because these inhibitory mirror neurons sit in a mesial premotor area, pre-SMA, which plays a major role in motor control. This is the paper with Marco Iacoboni done at UCLA I was mentioning before, where we basically reproduced the same results that were obtained in macaques at the single neuron level. So when the intention is different, the same grasp is treated differently by the neurons, and what is active is the ventral premotor cortex, basically. So to a certain degree, the mechanism is sensitive not only to motor goals, but also to motor intentions. And yes, here's an EEG experiment done on humans that shows that even in humans, the activation of the mirror mechanism is lower when you observe someone with respect to when you perform the action. And this is just a flash to remind you that even when we read something describing an action, or we listen to a sentence describing an action, you still see the activation of the motor system. So my motor system activates when I grasp a glass, when I see you grasping a glass, but also when I read he grasped the glass, okay? So the discovery of mirror neurons in the macaque monkey brain and in the human brain suggested a more direct access to intentional states of others is available. And this is, to put it in a nutshell, my point, at the basis of the capacity to understand others' intentional behavior, both from a phylogenetic and ontogenetic point of view, there is a basic functional mechanism that I call embodied simulation, which exploits the intrinsic functional organization of the motor system and a variety of mirror mechanisms Indeed, the discovery of mirror neurons in the motor cortex showed us only the tip of a much bigger iceberg, because other cortical sites, like the insula, somatosensory areas like S1 and S2, the amygdala, are activated both during the first-person experience and the observation of emotion or sensations experienced by others. The emotions can be disgust, pain, sensation is touch. Now we are exploring affiliative touch, sensuous touch, and with interesting stuff coming out of that. So the mirror mechanism broadly maps the sensory representation of the action, emotion, or sensation of another onto the perceiver's own motor, visceromotor, or somatosensory bodily formatted representation of that action, emotion, or sensation. I'm using here the notion of representation in a pretty distinct way. Normally, when we think of representation, we think about linguistic representation. Here we have to deal with the fact that the same content can be mapped in different formats. It can be mapped in a linguistic format, so you have a propositional representation, but it can also be mapped in a bodily format. So you have a bodily formatted representation, which is exactly what we have been dealing with so far. So this mapping enables one to perceive the action, emotion, or sensation of another as if she were performing that action or experiencing that emotion or sensation herself. So embodied simulation theory provides a unitary account of basic aspects of social cognition, showing that people reuse their own mental states or processes represented with a bodily format in order to functionally attributing them to others. Yes. So I think when we speak of mind reading, we should introduce some qualification. Mind reading normally squares with a meta-representational enterprise. Your behavior makes sense to me only to the extent that I can form in my mind a mental representation of your own mental representation that led you to perform that specific behavior. I would call it mind reading in a strict or very narrow sense. In a broader sense, mind reading can be like, I tried to sketch out so far, okay, without necessarily employing propositional attitudes. Which doesn't, of course, and luckily enough, means that the thoughts of our partners are transparent to us, or would be enough. We don't want to have it. So we do not necessarily experience the specific contents of other experience, but we experience others as having experiences similar to ours. Thank you.